Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. In some ways, I feel like the dramatic music may be more appropriate for this session than almost any other, given that we're talking about education in emergencies. My name is Lori Heninger. I'm the director of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies.
And I am Essa Al-Mannai, the director of Reach Out to Asia. We're also a member and a partner with our colleagues from the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies.
It's been a great partnership between INEE and ROTA over this last year and a half or so, and we're going to talk about that today. We're going to give a brief introduction as to what education in emergencies is, what INEE is. We're going to talk a little bit about the minimum standards for education. We're going to talk about the work that ROTA is doing applying the minimum standards in Nepal. So this is going to be a little bit different, the presentation, than the other, I think, presentations you've seen. Essa and I will go back and forth as the slides come up. So it's going to be interwoven, the INEE, the standards, ROTA, and the project in Nepal.
Well, great. We wanted it to be more interactive, and if anyone would have any questions, we'll be very happy to answer once we're done. We had provided some case studies on the subject that we have talked about, so that whoever is leaving, you can take some information from the lessons learned, how applicable, the standards that we have learned, how much did we learn from applying those standards from what we have done in Nepal.
I'd like to just thank Sheikha Moza for her lifting up the issue of conflict and education and focusing on that in her presentations in the conference. I'd like to start with a quote from a young person, a mother that I met in a refugee camp, who said, if we had education, and this was displacement due to conflict, if we had education, we would be fighting this war with the pen and not with a sword. This was a young woman who was illiterate. She was just going to school, and she was learning the value of education for herself. Somebody else said, the silver lining in the dark cloud of this conflict is that all our children are in one place, and we can educate them. People that have been displaced, that are in conflict and crisis situations, natural disasters, wars, they want education for their children. It's one of the top 1 or 2 things that they say they want when they're asked. So as the donor community and as people with the means, if we are not providing that, we are not doing a service to what people really are asking for. And I think Gordon Brown did a great job this morning, but he did a little too much focusing on Africa. And I think that there's sort of a stereotype. There's an idea that Africa is the place where the problems are. Well, I can tell you that coming from the United States, we had an enormous problem around education after Hurricane Katrina. In Japan, after the tsunami, there was a huge displacement. There is a huge displacement. So this is not just something that happens in flooding in Pakistan or war in Afghanistan. This happens in developed countries as well. So I just want to set that stage to begin with. What is education in emergencies? You can read this. You've probably been reading it as I've been talking, so that I don't have to read it to you, thank God, because it's the worst pedagogy in the whole world, is to read the PowerPoint slides. But I think the bottom line is that education is a fundamental human right, and it is not a human right that stops during conflict or crisis. You can't just say, oh, I'm sorry, your human right to education has been suspended for the time of this disaster, or it's been suspended for the time that your country is in conflict. Because for a lot of countries, for the poorest countries, the average length of conflict is 12 years. For refugee situations, the average length of displacement is 17 years. We can't be saying, oh, I'm sorry, your right to education is suspended for these 17 years. If we're talking about 5 years for basic literacy and numeracy, we are losing at least 3 cohorts of young people in situations of refugee displacement. So why education in emergencies, other than it's a basic human right? Education in a crisis situation, the school can be the center. It really can provide information on where the landmines are, what water's safe to drink, where to get vaccinations. And oftentimes what happens is that parents in the community don't have the access to that information, but when their kids get it, they bring that information home. So the impact of education is multiplied significantly. The other thing that parents tell us is that when their kids are in school, they have the capacity to stand online for food, to rebuild their homes, to look for other children that may be lost during the displacement. So there's a really critical element that school provides outside of the basic psychosocial and cognitive security and safety of school.
All right, so taking the platform, as Reach Out to Asia, we are an NGO that's under the umbrella of Qatar Foundation that's focused on primary and secondary education, providing quality access for education through building schools, rehabilitating schools, doing teacher quality training, curriculum development, and also disaster risk reductions for communities that are affected by natural disasters to maintain, the sustainability of the students' attendance to schools. So since 6 years of our operation, Nepal was one of the countries that was on the top of our agenda, looking at the natural place that Nepal has, among other countries. Not to mention that its position as 138 among of the 172 countries from the Human Development Index, and also the instability together along with the lack of resources for accelerated educational challenges. The natural disasters are one of the main causes for the reduction of the slow of the educational process that's taking place along in the country. So what we do as Reach Out to Asia is that we don't look at the educational process as just the school, the teacher, the book. We also look at the community as a whole. We target most marginalized communities, and we need to make sure that, what are the root causes that prevent the education process from moving on. So we started our project with disaster risk reduction. We looked at the environment as a whole and what would affect the students from attending the schools. So why did we go firstly with the disaster risk reduction? Basically because of the vulnerability of the earthquakes and the floods, a huge amount of deaths from the students trying to attend the school, or even houses that are being destroyed by those floods. And other facts are basically that there are at least 2 people that die every day during the time when we were planning to start our works in Nepal in 2009. Not to mention that most of the schools will be used as a shelter during disasters, which would stop the educational process. This is the link where we saw that the minimum standards from the INEE would be the tool that would provide us with a holistic context of assessing the problem and moving forward. And then based on that, when we identified the most marginalized, we saw that the Kailali district within Nepal could be the area with the most needs and where ROTA's intervention should be. So why did we choose the Kailali district? Is basically because of it being the most affected districts in Nepal because of the floods, and also the labor laws within Nepal wasn't facilitating the process of the families situations and also the income for those families. And it has one of the lowest human development index. As you can see from this picture, this is a picture of the district, during the floods, and you can see how the rivers are basically flowing through the districts. And whenever the rain comes, the floods happen, most of those rivers, you could see that the levels would go up and all the community would be paralyzed of continuing any daily normal activities.
The Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, we are an open global network of practitioners, academics, students. We have about 6,700 members in 130 countries, and we are a true network. We, when I tell people I'm with INEE, the Interagency Network, they say, "Oh, you provide tents for schools in disaster situations." I said, actually, we don't do that. Then they say, "Oh, you train teachers to teach in." I say, no, we don't do that either. What we do is to provide a safe, informal space for people from sort of teachers on the ground in disaster situations to policymakers at the World Bank and the UN to come together to take off their institutional hats and to sit down to identify where the gaps are within the education and emergencies field, and then to figure out collaboratively how to fill those gaps. So we do a lot of work on information gathering and dissemination. We do a lot of work on convening. We do work on looking at education and fragility, fragile states, or education and resilience, and how education can contribute to fragility or resilience. And we also have developed tools. I've been listening these past few days a lot about sort of the high-tech technology, cell phones and whatever. We have very low technology. We have the good old-fashioned kind of technology, although we do a tremendous amount of work on the internet also. But we create tools that practitioners can use in the field. And these tools are not created by INEE, the Secretariat, because we are very small. There are only 5 of us. Our members create these tools. And the INEE minimum standards were created by about 3,500 people in over 60 countries. And it is sort of the seminal document for education in emergencies and for disaster risk reduction preparedness for emergencies. And the reason it's gotten such good spread is because our members created it. Far be it for me to say that sitting in New York, I would have the answers for every context. That really came from our members. And you can see how INEE works from this slide. We have task teams that anybody can join. If you're not a member of INEE, you can become a member for free. You will get a lot of information. Our task teams include a task team on gender, HIV/AIDS, quality education, early childhood development, adolescence and youth. We have 2 working groups, one on the minimum standards and other INEE tools, and a second is a working group on education and fragility. And then our members come together generally just to discuss, to plan, to do work to better the field. And I think I probably covered this one already.
All right, so moving back to ROTA and the work that we're doing in Nepal, basically what we have done is after analyzing the situation and using the minimum standard toolkits that we'll talk about briefly, is that since our intervention, we have noticed that the numbers of accidents and also the affected people have drastically dropped after the intervention within the Kailali district. basically from 23,600 affected households, the number have gone almost 3,000 houses. And also the total destroyed numbers of houses from 15,000 to 7,000, and the population have drastically reduced, reduced from 15,000 to 12. And the number of deaths, and this is one of the things that, one of the stories, some of the stories that we've heard from families who were reluctant to send their children to attend the school, is that some of the kids just fell into the river from the floods and they just died on their way to school. What ROTA have done is that we supported building few bridges to the schools to make sure that families would be comfortable. And the number of deaths just fell from 26 to 1 between 2008 and 2009. You can see, and this is a regular situation in any flood that would take place, and this is an annual event that would take place in Kailali district during monsoon seasons. So what we have done basically, our project have focused on enhancing the knowledge of the disaster risk reduction by building the capacity of the teachers, the students, family members, and communities, by designing and promoting the school's standards through the disaster risk reduction. So as you can see, it's not just a hardware process by just building schools. It's also about building the capacity and the mindset of the community and the teachers, the students, the family members, into building this holistic culture of disaster risk reduction, and also by advocating for the policy and the governance reform in securing the resources. Of course, not to mention the enabling the disadvantaged secondary education for the students. Most of the time, it's the primary education that's taking under consideration, while secondary education, we've noticed that it's not always on the priority of the list.
INEE, as I said, creates tools. We have a number of them up front here. If you would like to pick them up after the session is over, you are absolutely welcome. I find myself carrying a very heavy suitcase most of the time with all kinds of information in it. But we have done a lot of work on, we call them pocket guides to gender, pocket guides to inclusive education, pocket guide to supporting learners with disabilities. We did guidance notes on teaching and learning. We also have guidance notes on teacher compensation, because in emergency situations, teachers are often educated, and what happens? Well, NGOs go in and they hire the teachers because they're literate and numerate at much more than they would be making as a teacher. So there's a huge, we say there's a big sucking sound when the teachers move from the classrooms to the NGOs. I want to make sure that teachers are paid equitably. We have the tool that we use most often. It's the minimum standards for education, preparedness, response, and recovery. The minimum standards, like I said, was created by many people. We have a revised edition now in 2010. There are 5 domains within the minimum standards: foundational, access and learning environment, teaching and learning, teachers and other education personnel, and education policy. We have 19 standards within the minimum standards under those domains, and 11 cross-cutting issues such as gender, HIV/AIDS, etc. The standards are not prescriptive. They don't tell you how to do what is suggested, because they need to be contextualized and adapted in each specific setting based on the situation, the culture, the curriculum that exists in the country. So I think the next slide is going to talk about how specifically some of these standards have been adapted in the Nepal context.
So basically, as we have gone to this community, basically, and even in any other interventions that we plan to go to, the first question was that, how do we do this process? How do we measure the effect? How do we engage communities? And how where should we start? Should we start with the schools? Should we start with the infrastructure, the family, the government, Ministry of Education? A lot of stakeholders that are always in the picture, but during the case, and the good thing that, what we've got from the minimum standards is, as Laurie mentioned, it provides you with a holistic approach, and it tells you like who are the stakeholders, what to do, and basically it's preparedness, response, and recovery. And this is where it came into picture, and this is how we applied it. What we're giving here is basically some of the situations, the poor conditions, and how did these minimum standards from the interagency network and emergencies have helped us, to tackle this problem, starting from the poor management and coordination, whether it is from those stakeholders that we have mentioned. Basically, what the standards have provided with us is basically who is it that you should work with. For example, the community representatives and the coordinations, and also the assessment and the monitoring and evaluation. This is basically, these are the foundational standards that the minimum standards will provide for you to take into consideration once you're trying to assess a situation under disaster. And then you come to accessibility, whether it is basically the students, the infrastructure, the classrooms, and the materials. What would assess that from the minimum standards is basically the protection and the vulnerability of those situations, the facilities and the services, and also the tools that are available for the students and the school. And then looking at the education and the quality, what we noticed is that it wasn't enough and there were no enough competent teachers to facilitate the recovery of the educational process. And what we have from the minimum standards and the part of the teaching and learning is basically for you to look at the curricula, the teaching and procedures, and the development for the support, the infrastructure and the learning processes, and also the teaching and the other educational personnel. And finally, the social disparities between from the gender and the education and the community itself. The boys and girls access for the school, and the education policy from the minimum standards provides you with basically the law and the policy formulation for those standards, and the preparedness and implementation. So these are the standards for coordination that we have used in our project in Nepal. More information you'll be able to see within the case study that we have prepared, and it's also available for you for your reference. Basically, I'll take you very quickly through some of those standards and how did ROTA apply it. For example, from the project level realization, we have worked with 4 available actors, agencies, to help the support, and each one of them have brought their own experience on the ground when it came to the realization and the coordination for the project. And also we made sure that the coordination from all the stakeholders, from the communities and the national government, and also the vulnerable displaced communities have also been able to participate, to make sure that it would provide an ownership from all of those, being an early coordination and having a stake into the process of recovery. And also the formulation and the work through the district project advisory committee. So we the community itself was part of this committee, and they felt that they've taken a part into the decision-making process and the assessment of this program. Part of the partners that we worked with were also from our side Vodafone into the funding partner for this project, and also Action Aid from Nepal. And then we looked, the standards would provide you with those areas to look at and how you could tackle it. One of them is the access and learning environment, standard number 1. How did ROTA apply it is basically the selection of the most disadvantaged group. This is what the standards would tell you to look for, and how would you help them. Basically what we saw is the geographically remote flooded affected communities through the affected schools, and also the assessment through the 4 A's of education, which is widely used standard for agencies to work, and also the support of the 2 groups disadvantaged through the advocating for their right for access for education. The standard number 3, which you'll be able to see from the minimum standards and the facilitation and the services. Basically, this looks at the infrastructure and how you should support it, before, during, and after the disaster. What we have done is 83 schools have been rehabilitated by Reach Out to Asia, and basically we've equipped first aid kits, child-centered learning materials, and also another 75 have also, we are also expecting to equip from 2012 and 2013. Basically, this gives you an idea about the community and how was it before the intervention. Regular house that you can see on the upper left picture. During the floods, you would see the water flooding by, and people would just be putting rocks and wood just to pass by. And this is a minor situation that you see. Other houses could be severely affected. Solutions that we have seen are like temporary tents being provided to support the continuation of the process. However, what we have seen from the minimum standards is that this is more of a reactional approach. What we have done by using the standards is basically we have chosen the most protected areas to build the school, and based on that, we acquired the land, and then the school would be built to make sure that prior to the effect and prior to the floods, we'll make sure that the school wouldn't be affected and access would be easier. As you can see, community members being involved within the assessment, the choice of land, and also the construction of the school. So the teaching, I mean, that's too much text for you to go through, but just to give you an idea about how did we engage and facilitate the community into basically the involvement of preparedness and also response and recovery is basically by teaching, by involving the teachers, the professional development and their support, and the infrastructure and learning process. We've seen it as a holistic process where all stakeholders would be involved, and we made sure that all of these would be together within the process of preparedness. As you can see, standard number 2 is involved with the engagement of those policies, and also making sure that it's not just a written policy. Community members, teachers, and others will be involved within the implementation, and we also worked on improving the access of educational to the marginalized groups. So I think basically, I tried just going back. What we're trying to showcase from our side as Reach Out to Asia is basically how did we come up with those standards, and how did it help us into basically assess the situation, mitigate the problem, and also making sure that in the future, access would be possible, and the educational process wouldn't be interrupted during those situations. The case study would provide you with much more information and the lessons learned from our experience into using those standards. We're also part of the working group with the INEE, so we're heavily involved, and also making sure, another thing that have helped us by using the standards is also reviewing proposals for projects that we would receive as an organization. It gave us a scope and a lens into evaluating the process of any project we receive from local or international NGO. Did they look at all the stakeholders? How much did they put within the involvement of marginalized communities? Have they put an emphasis into equal access for education, infrastructure, first aid toolkits, and other things? So so far, I mean, it has been a very effective tool that we have used, and I'm sure that my colleague Lori will tell you more about maybe other cases and how did others have found the minimum standards useful for their projects.
This is, for our members, this is perfect. The idea of the application and the contextualization application, and then writing a case study so that other members can learn from this and they can do similar things in their regions. I think given that we've got about 7 minutes, 6 minutes, it would be very wonderful to hear from you comments, questions, thoughts. So if you have comments, questions, thoughts, just raise your hand and the mic will magically come to you.
Thank you very much.
It's on.
Okay. I think this is very interesting what you're doing. As a matter of fact, I have an opportunity to go to Afghanistan, to Kabul, to work for the Swedish International Development Authority to head up the education portfolio. So what you are talking about today would be highly relevant for a place like Afghanistan. And I think the question I have really for you is, all the efforts that have been put in for preparedness, mitigating risks, deal with emergency and conflict situations, to what extent do you think that these measures will be sustainable? So if you look back 10 years later, do you think we need to restart all the efforts again? Or do you think you can see some of the elements that would be sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we also take this question? And is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thanks for this very interesting topic. My name is Mohammed Diab. I work for United Nations World Food Program. So I just want to have few comments and then a question, if possible. Education in emergency really is one of the main haunting problems which facing many organizations. Emergencies, whether emanating from refugee situation or IDP situation or population who have not moved to either into camps within a country or as a refugee to another country. So there are a lot to be really asked about the status and how to respond to education needs in different type of situation. The situation now in Nepal is really for a response to, or the project is a response to a predictable flooding situation, which is completely different from responding in a situation of man-made disaster and conflict, where massive movement of populations takes place. If you take in Dadaab now in Kenya, over 400,000 people are there, and this is the smallest, probably number 4 city in Kenya. So the question is, in a situation like this one, how do you ensure the response of international community to the needs of people in this situation? World Food Program is working very closely with others in terms of food for education, school feeding programs, and there are a lot of need and resources required for this type of things. How do international community respond? That is number one. And in a situation like this where there are long-term type of situation for refugees, what type of curriculum do you think is would best suit refugees? Is it the curriculum of original country or curriculum of receiving countries? And then how do we ensure that children in classes work towards improving the overall environment of conflict by different ethnic groups and different tribes and whatever within the same situation could really work and interact together in such a situation? Thank you.
Great questions. We have about 3 minutes. Essa, do you want to take the sustainability question, or take whatever you want, and then we'll close?
Yeah. Basically, just to put it into context regarding the refugees situation. I mean, what we're doing at Nepal is, as you mentioned, is more of a natural disaster situation. However, we're also available in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Situations of an earthquake, for example, or even areas that are in conflict. Just to put it into context, what we have found from our experience with the minimum standards is that involvement of stakeholders has always or almost been similar, in any situation of these. You're having before the disaster, whether it is natural, man-made, during or even after. We also work with the refugee camps in Nahr al-Barid in Lebanon and also in Bangladesh. But most of these are like settled camps. And what we have noticed is that it gives us a good reference to assess, the educational process within these camps. I wouldn't say that you would have to use all the tools, all the standards or the sections from the standards, but some of them comes very much handy for assessing the situation and also their involvement.
Great. I think the sustainability question is critical, and I think the way you get sustainability is bottom up as well as top down. There has to be some kind of meeting in the middle. And I think that there are some case studies online from INEE that talk about this, ingraining things, building bridges, in a conflict or in a natural disaster situation is one way to ensure that there is some continuity around the flooding situation and being able to get to school. So I think that looking at those kind of specific things are really, really important in terms of sustainability and community ownership. One of the things that we hear on a regular basis is that the standard for community participation may be the one that's used most often and is the most successful. Ensuring response of the international community around education and humanitarian situations, 2% of all of the humanitarian funding that's given goes to education, 2%. The commitment is 4%. It never reaches 4%. So one of the things that we are going to be looking at in education and emergencies over this next, in the education and emergencies community over this next 2 years, is how do we advocate to ensure that education is part of the first line intervention. Curriculum, that is one of the thorniest issues ever. Countries where people have been relocated don't necessarily want education provided at all, and maybe not in their curriculum because they don't want people to stay. And we also want people, if possible, to go back. So there's a fine line, and I don't think anybody's come up with a definitive answer on that one. In INEE, we have been doing work on the relationship between the impact of education on conflict and fragility. And we've been doing work with ministries of education to sit down with them before sector plans are developed, and to work with them, and it's a demand-driven process. It's got to be a demand-driven process to look at their education policy and planning, to look at what language of instruction, where are the schools, who's doing the teaching, what are the schools named, because all of these things can contribute to a return to conflict, and we don't want that to happen. So we want to do really conflict-sensitive policy. Would you like to have the last word?
Sure. Yeah, just going back to the subject of sustainability, this is a question that we have always been asking ourselves within Reach Out to Asia. How do we define sustainability, you know? And I mean, literally you can't put it as one definition, because in every project, in every country that we work in, sustainability differs a little bit, you know, whether it is you're working with the refugees, for example. Your main goal is for them, of course, to go back home. So how would you make this educational program sustainable? At the same time, earthquakes situations, or even communities that are just poor, you know, sustainability is not just about making sure those students are finishing the school, but it's also about would they get, you know, any outcome out of it? Are they going to get a job secured after that, so that the community would see that there is an outcome, you know, from this educational process and from their children attending this school. However, going back to the standards, is that it showcases to us that, you know, in order for you to assure your sustainability, you make sure the involvement of those people, the infrastructure, accessibility, you know, and this is a live example that we have seen. Now that the community sees that the death rate have fallen from 28 to 1, they would they wouldn't be that worried for their children to go and attend the school and not to fall into a river. My final word is that we hope that, you know, our humble contribution, you know, to this project and to the network, you know, have provided you with a good example on how those standards could be used on a live context. There are lessons learned. I wouldn't say that, you know, the project is 100% success. However, there is a tool that would tell you exactly what to look for and how to put into context. We're participating with the group, and we're still in the process of improving those standards. It is a great pleasure to work with the Interagency Network as a partner, and we are contributing through our feedback, case studies, working group, but at the same time we're learning a lot from them.
And us from you, the membership and all of us. So thank you, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you all.